Hey, hello everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the Earth System Governance 2024 Forum on Reimagining Earth System Governance in the era of Polycrisis. This forum takes the current scenario of compounding global challenges as a starting point to reimagine governance. It was carefully put together by a coordinating group of the Earth System Governance Scientific Steering Committee, represented here by DG Webster, just coming after Frank. And the main innovation is the bottom-up way in which it was built. There was a call for proposals to their system governance community, and the whole program of the forum resulted from different proposals that came from task forces, working groups, research centers, the South-South Committee, and the Early Career Researchers Committee. Thus, everyone will be able to enjoy a whole week full of activities in different time zones. We have 1,200 people registered for the forum, and 49 sessions for people to enjoy. I will now give a short presentation about the network for the ones who are new, and also a few highlights from the years 23-24. So what do? We are the largest social science research network on governance and global environmental change. And we do research on the aims to explore political solutions and novel, justice, and more effective governance systems to cope with global environmental change. In our work, we expand the global mobilization of researchers in our field. We try to stimulate and facilitate research collaboration in a vibrant community. We try to inform and advise at the policy and science interface. The network also fosters community and collaboration across disciplines, geographies, and career stages. For instance, the picture you just were seeing was the one that from last year's first South-South dialogues that joined South scholars from the so-called Global South, early career scholars. That was in Nijmegen. That in a little bit about the governance of the network, we have a scientific steering committee composed of 13 scholars from different parts of the globe and different career stages. We have the International Project Office. Right now, Blake Harvey is our network coordinator. And also we have 2 student assistants. And thanks, Blake, for helping us in this, putting together the forum. Without her, it would not be possible. So, and a little bit of information about how the Earth System Governance Project works and how it's organized. We have the annual conferences. The annual conferences are key to mobilize their system governance community every year. And we have this long-standing tradition of global conferences in which partners with universities and organizations all over the world organize the conference. So we have 14, so far we have had 14 annual conferences since 2007. We have also the science implementation plans. The first science implementation plan was published in 2009. And in 2018, there was the new science implementation plan was set for the agenda for the next decade of research. So now we are 6 years since the second science plan was launched. So this is our current research framework in which we have contextual conditions and research lenses and more or less guide our research within the network. Moreover, we have task forces and working groups, and they are all groups that are formalized and mobilized scholars to collaboratively engage with key issues of governance of the environment and sustainability within a well-defined research agenda and in alignment with the Earth System Governance research plan. Currently, we have 9 active task forces and 6 active working groups. Besides, we have research centers spread across the globe. The last one that was created was the Bath Research Center. Welcome, Bath. And so that's very important for us to have this research center, because that's also a way to grow regionally and spread out our community. So some highlights of 2023-2024. The network in 2023, the community is growing. We welcomed 58 new members, bringing our total network to 557 members. That's a growth from 2022. The growth includes 48 new research fellows, 9 new senior research fellows, and 1 new lead faculty member. So that's more or less how we have been increasing until 2023. We had the 2023 annual report was recently published. You can see the QR code there. If anyone wants to download it, just please take a moment to focus on the QR code so you can download the report. So the report highlights a year of impactful research, global collaborations, and also important milestones. The report underscores the project's ongoing commitments to address pressing global challenges through interdisciplinary research and collective action. So one highlight of 2023 was the Radboud Conference on Earth System Governance. It was the first fully hybrid conference with 14 parallel panels per time slot. There were 530 people attending the conference and 120 online attendees. We had also special tickets for non-academic day passes. We had promotional webinars to also for young and early career scholars to practice how to, for instance, host or be a chair in a panel. We had, for the first time, our South-South dialogue events, and also for the first time, we had 20 scholars from mid and low-income countries that received free fee waivers or travel costs. And thanks to Idols, who were one of our co-hosts, and was a conference with a highly engaged co-hosts. They hosted for several semi-plenaries and was the first fully vegan catering conference as well. And there we also in 2023, we have the South-South Initiative with 6 webinars held since March 2023. We had 400 online participants during these webinars and 450 views on YouTube and the recordings are still available. So the South-South Initiative started in 2022, when our focus has been on strengthening our research community based in the so-called Global South. We had through target outreach, like the ones you just saw, the webinars, online workshops, publications. We are now organizing a special issue for the System Governance Journal, but also trying to have special activities and annual conferences. So the network will focus on increasing research and activities relevant for those based on the so-called Global South. Besides, we have the launch of the NIME Agenda. The NIME Agenda is a comprehensive framework designed to foster transformative research and engagement in the field of Earth system governance. It is a result of a collaborative and consultative process that started during the Radboud 2023 annual conference in Nijmegen. The agenda sets the priorities for advancing interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approach to tackle global governance challenges. And it also is a call for stronger partnerships and collaboration among diverse knowledge systems, but also with practitioners. So, and please attend, there will be the launch of the 9-year agenda during this week in the forum. Besides, we have had this open access education. It's a course offered at Utrecht University. It's called Global Governance of Their System. It's an open course, and people have been registered from all over the globe. There were last year were 210 participants registered. We have also communication, Twitter, and transitioned more to LinkedIn right now. We have our website, newsletters, so several ways to communicate among us, the community, and also between the community and the outside world. We have flagship publications. This is the project. We have 4 publication outlets, including the System Governance Journal, the MIT Press book series, the Cambridge University Press book series, and the Cambridge Element series. For instance, the System Governance Journal was established in 2018. It's a flagship publication of the System Governance Project. It's an open access journal that's very important for scholars in the Global South, but also I think scholars in the Global North. So far, there were 18 volumes, including more than 135 articles. Recently received an impressive impact factor, attaining position as a leading QAnon journal, GCI, and now ranked in 12th out of 760 journals in political science, international relations. So this is an example of the impact factor of 5.6. So very impressive. Thanks. Also thanks to Frank Bierman. So this is an example of the Cambridge Element series. It's a very important outlet because it offers concise, authoritative studies on and governance of complex ecological systems. So this is many of the series, how they look like. The Cambridge book series, also several edited volumes with a focus on harvesting outcomes from the system governance projects. So there were a few outlets that trying to give an overview of the project in the last 10 years, the agency, adaptiveness, and also on architecture. So several of the books, all books are peer-reviewed. Actively, so far 11 books published since 2019, trying to harvest what the community has produced in the last 10, 15 years. The MIT book series also address challenges that the challenge that fundamental and applied research faces in confronting the human influence on our biological and physical systems on the planet. The focus is to develop integrated governance systems for sustainable development of the Earth's social ecological systems. So that's also an example of the MIT book series, 80 authors and contributors. Finally, and not at least or not, I would like to honor Frank Bierman, who is with us today. He's the founding director of the Earth System Governance Project and has been recently awarded the 2024 Volvo Prize for his pioneering research on environmental governance. So our congratulations for you, Frank. And not only it's a well-deserved recognition of your massive contribution to our system governance research and also policy over the several decades, but also it's not only a welcome affirmation of the role of social science that can play in informing debates about sustainability, but perhaps most importantly is the acknowledgement of the quality and character of your achievements, in particularly It recognizes their vital role in building a community of scholars around the concept of Earth System Governance. As a founding director of the Earth System Governance Project, you have been instrumental in translating Earth System Governance from concept to community. Without the vision and energy you have brought to the project, we would not have the large, committed, and diverse network of scholars that we have today. We would also like to recognize the main ongoing contributions you make to the community, like all the publications you saw, or the outlets, but also through the task force, the revitalization of their System Governance Foundation, and your policy engagement and mobilization issues such as solar geoengineering. Finally, we would like to pay tribute to some of your other qualities that helped nurture the community over many years, including your role as an outstanding ambassador of the network, your mentoring and support for early career researchers, and the many things you have done behind the scenes to smooth the administrative path to the IPO and its host institutions. So congratulations, Frank, once again. We look forward to our continued work together, and as we carry forward the vision of the community, and we have done so much to build. So pass the word to you, Frank. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cristina. It's very, very flattering. Thank you so much. I'm deeply honored by your statement. Thank you so much. Well, it is true. Greetings from Stockholm, first of all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. So I am in Stockholm, and this prize will be handed out tomorrow here at the ceremony in Stockholm. And this, the Volvo Environment Prize exists for 35 years, and it will be tomorrow for the first time in the history of this prize that it will be handed out to political scientists to receive this award. And that's, of course, to some extent a personal recognition, but beyond that, it's also clearly a recognition of our entire community. It's a recognition, in my understanding, that the planetary polycrisis in which we are, which is a topic of this conference, is in essence a political crisis. It's a crisis of our institutions. It's a crisis of our governance systems. And it's clear that we need to have better institutions. We need to have institutions at the local, national, and local level which are more effective, which are more just, and which are more democratic. And analyzing these institutional and governance questions, which are so important, that is exactly what the Earth System Governance Research Community has been done for the last 20 years. And I think this amazing conference that this SSC Scientific Steering Committee and all the colleagues have put together, this amazing conference is a testament to that fact. With so many interesting presentations, when we look around the program, so many interesting presentations also around the globe being made possible by this online setting. So many interesting presentations from these many lively and very strong task forces that Cristina has laid out. A lot of engagement from early career researchers, which is so fundamental to keep this community going on in the next 20 years of its existence. So for me, as a person who has never missed an Earth System Governance Conference since the beginning, if you look at the timeline that Cristina has laid out, I was one of the first members of the community, that it's really wonderful to see this success and this dynamics in this community and what it has achieved over the last 20 years. Personally speaking, of course, I will stay on board with this community, and particularly, as Cristina laid already out, I will focus very strongly for the next couple of years still on working with the publication outlets, the publication portfolio of our community of the Earth System Governance Network, the book series with MIT Press, the book series on Earth System Governance with the Cambridge University Press, the short book series, the Cambridge Elements in Earth System Governance, which are the short books, and also our wonderful flagship journal, Earth System Governance, which is open access. That means wherever you are on this planet, without any charge, you can download any article of the Earth System Governance Journal, which makes it so accessible for people from NGO, for people from outside universities, and in particular people in the Global South. So that's my call in a way for this conference also. We would very much welcome if you, as a participant in this conference, would consider maybe submitting your paper that you're presenting here, or any other type of the research that you are doing, submitting it to the Earth System Governance Journal. We will review it as quick as possible, or to any other of our book publishing series. And we will really highlight also this research on the website and the various outlets of the Earth System Governance Project. So in conclusion, here from Stockholm, I wish you all the best for this conference. I wish you all enjoyment of the deliberation that you will have over the next week. I will personally try to join as many panels as possible and see as many presentations as possible. And I very much hope to see many of you again next year at the next in-person Earth System Governance Conference in South Africa. Many thanks for these very kind words from the SSC, from Cristina, and from the entire community. And take care and enjoy all this fantastic conference. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, Frank, and congratulations again. And thank you, Cristina, for starting us off. Many of you know me, I'm DG Webster. I'm a member of the SCC and also one of the members of the planning committee for this ESG Forum 2024, along with Kaila Tianhara, Dhanasri Jairam, and Chucks Okereke. And I have to admit that those people did a lot more work than I did. So thank you, guys. And if you run into them, thank them for their hard work on this forum. But my main job here and now is to introduce our plenary speaker, Susan Park, who is a professor of global governance at the University of Sydney. She is a senior research fellow of the Earth Systems Governance Project and a co-convener with Dr. Teresa Camarance at the University of Toronto of the Earth System Governance Task Force, Accountability in Global Environmental Governance. Dr. Park is also an associate editor of the journal Global Environmental Politics and was the chair of the environmental studies section of the ISA from 2015 to 2017. She has been a visiting scholar at many august institutions, including the London School of Economics, Oxford University, and the Technical University of Munich, among others. She has written many books and papers, including her most recent edited volume, The Politics of 21st Century Environmental Disasters, which came out in 2023 with Routledge, and which I think is a good indication that she's already been thinking of polycrisis, which is our theme, of course, for this forum. And in fact, I nominated Susan for this particular role because she's the first person that I heard use that term, not just in an academic context, but also in the context of discussions with policymakers over different types of environmental issues. And I think bringing that climate change connection to all of these other types of issues, which is really important when we think about the world and all of the changes that social science might be able to foster, as Frank just mentioned. But to go on about Susan, Dr. Park is a theme lead for transformative governance at the Sydney Environment Institute, which explores the transitions required across a range of institutional spaces, including politics, economics, food, finances, and energy. It examines the interconnections, opportunities, and barriers, and the myriad ways in which individuals, communities, and governments are responding to these transitions in a climate-changed and climate-challenged world. And the themes that they aim to address include examining the opportunities and barriers relating to transitioning systems at a variety of scales, how to elevate the role of communities in leading system transitions to ensure that they receive optimal benefits from those transitions that impact them, and developing innovative policies and practices to support efficient and just systems transition. Dr. Park has also been working with teams to examine transformation in Pacific Island countries in relation to the renewable energy and access to climate adaptation finance, including simplified access, working with teams on critical minerals and mining in Australia as part of global supply chains for renewable energy, and producing and featuring in events and podcasts that impact on transition, including communities on the front line, as well as podcasts on critical minerals for the public. More recently, Dr. Park has been working with the new Net Zero Initiative at the University of Sydney to bring social science concerns upstream to STEM research on the renewable energy transition in order to better address the polycrisis. So without further ado, I would like to thank Dr. Park for coming and giving us this opening to our wonderful week of activities.
Thank you very much, DG. That was a very kind introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. So it's an absolute delight to be this year's Earth Systems Governance Forum event keynote speaker. As you know, the theme for this year is reimagining Earth systems governance in an era of polycrisis. And DG is absolutely right. I have been thinking about this for a little bit because as you all know, we are experiencing multiple intersecting crises, many of our own making, and it's important to reflect on what we can do to slow the drivers of crises and to bolster responses to help strengthen our Earth systems. So to that effect, for the next 40 to 45 minutes, I'm going to talk about responsibility. I'm going to talk about accountability. I'm going to talk about eco-justice and grievance mechanisms and what we can do to transform global governance. So the really probably first place to start is very much to look at this idea of the polycrisis. Now, this is something that Adam Tooze popularized not that long ago. It has a much longer history, but essentially we can get to this idea of the polycrisis that we are experiencing multiple overlapping and intersecting crises. And this is very much ranging from financial crises and instability, trade wars, wars of aggression, genocide, the conflagration of the Middle East, compounding food crises, food shortages, water shortages, the fact that we have identified 7 million known dead from COVID-19, which the WHO recognizes as probably a severe underestimation and is continuing to grow. Since 2020, many aspects of life for many people, particularly in developing countries, have become more bleak, with gains in developing states being reversed in terms of increased poverty levels and ill health, and rising public debt, which may be heralding a new global debt crisis. Only 16% of the SDGs are on track for 2030. Combined with the rapid acceleration of biodiversity loss and ecosystem threats, the surpassing of known ecological boundaries is really highlighting that the polycrisis is apt and outside perhaps the concept of the Anthropocene, one of the few utilized ideas that's coming close to grappling with humanity's current predicament. In 2019, the Office of Disaster Risk Reduction reported that surprise is the new normal, as global environmental change accelerates, such that new risks and correlations are emerging in ways that had not been anticipated. And we can identify pretty much daily more news about how the polycrisis, particularly environmental crises, are accelerating in ways that are much faster than anticipated. And the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction declared that an era of hazard by hazard risk reduction is over, that we can no longer think of these as independent, isolated events. And so we can identify awareness and data collection as a first step, but we also need to identify how to respond to the fact that previously linear and isolated events are now interacting with one another to create fast-moving, systemic, and potentially irreversible changes in unanticipated ways. So how do we govern our Earth systems? The 2018 Earth Systems Governance Science and Implementation Plan identifies the contextual conditions and the important research lenses through which to view continuity and change in Earth systems governance. And Cristina showed that fabulous diagram earlier about how those are intertwined. But what I see as the real value of the plan is its engagement with different ways of knowing, different methods, and recognition of disciplinary depth and interdisciplinary and transdisciplinarity. So what I'm going to do here is to focus on disciplinary depth using a constructivist lens through which to view the sovereign state system and its institutions with a view to interrogating their ability to change. So a social constructivist approach recognizes that social agents produce, reproduce, and define the constitutive principles and structures by which and in which they operate. A constructivist approach differs from the main international relations theories that either argue that states have too little power to affect change in the international system, that's neorealism and neoliberal institutionalism, or that states can affect change on behalf of domestic social forces, liberal internationalism, Marxism, post-structuralism, and neo-Gramscian approaches. So constructivism looks at how states constitute the international system and through their collective understanding and actions can change it. This is important because while states are territorially bound, they continue to hold on to this organised hypocrisy of state sovereignty, that they somehow exist outside of the Earth's ecological systems. States are autonomous actors with political authority and territorial autonomy, which enables them to enact and extract natural resources for production as well as destruction. Their behaviour collectively constitutes the international system and in turn is constituted by it. Although states have ceded some authority to global institutions to address systemic patterns of environmental degradation, efforts to address potentially catastrophic changes in Earth systems through global governance remains fragmented, mired in accountability traps, and thus far largely inadequate to address the challenges we face. Revealing the constructed nature of these inadequacies brings us closer to better governing for the 21st century. So it's up to states to reshape global social ecological relations in ways that can actively engage in tackling multiple crises. Although states have constructed global environmental norms to address environmental challenges, they tend not to tackle economic growth. The global uptake of the concept of sustainable development in the 1990s really enabled states to seemingly reconcile economic growth and environmental degradation. This promotion of liberal environmentalism tended to ignore ecological limits. This propagates a now global political economy that continues to externalize environmental costs and impacts. States continue to promote economic growth, high levels of consumption, patterns of development, and unfettered markets that contribute to environmental degradation, with ecological feedback loops that reinforce the likelihood of accelerating environmental change. The use of international law on insurance, liability, and compensation is but one of the means being used to challenge state complicity, although this has its limits. So for some, the state will not be able to change, to obtain a socio-ecological transformation because there is an inherent glass ceiling within the structure of the state itself. And this is based on an unsustainable economic growth model of accumulation and consumption. This prevents advanced industrialized states from shifting from their current position as environmental states with institutions and practices to manage societal environmental interactions to transforming into green states that preference sustainability over economic growth. And this is especially the case for neoliberal environmental states like the United Kingdom, that preference financial systems over other public goods, and where environmental institutions have to conform to the economic rationality of the free markets. Being plugged into the global economy means that many developing countries have been encouraged to emulate this environmental state path, reinforcing the myopia of this framework. The idea that environmental externalities will not lead to a reckoning and that their risks can be managed. However, some challenge the state's reliance on fossil fuel energy systems, arguing that these can be replaced. And while this raises the spectre of the developmental state model as a pathway for the environmental state, it is still predicated on export-oriented economic growth and models of accumulation and consumption. What it highlights, however, is how states can reframe their understanding of environmental objectives as normalized within their mindsets. Although non-state actors such as corporations and NGOs can be legitimate bearers of authority, the collective responsibility for the health of the planet, including reacting to pandemics, to climate change, to species extinction, and ecosystem collapse, remains with the domain of sovereign states. So a major stumbling block to addressing the increasing frequency, intensity, and systemic nature of environmental crises is the social construction of the sovereign state as somehow separate from the Earth's planetary boundaries. So what this does is it delimits system-level responses to environmental problems to collective action. And it frames them as collective action games according to who benefits the most from international cooperation. And this can take place through negotiations in international environmental agreements, or like the COPs, the UNFCCC or the CBD, or voluntarily adhering to a range of guidelines, such as the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Guidelines, the Sendai framework. So what this does is it really precludes viewing states' activities as systematically contributing to both hazards and vulnerabilities around the world. And scholars have highlighted the role of the United Nations as helping to galvanize technical expertise, support for building institutions, and the provision of grants and loans to assist states. But it has been fundamentally unable to build that moral imperative that can mobilize local political will. So given the fluidity between the changing nature of Earth's systems and the multiple scales at which environmental crises are playing out, states may need to go beyond this methodological nationalism of being only concerned for themselves within a sovereign state towards a more methodological holist approach, which essentially analyzes how states constitute environmental crises as exogenous risks to be managed, and as I've argued in relation to environmental disasters, reveals two limitations. First, the social construction of sovereign states as politically autonomous and independent units with control over a containerized territory that is sealed off from ecological systems means that states fundamentally do not see crises as normal and reoccurring. And this enables them to constantly discount their likelihood and impact. Second, states remain vulnerable because they understand and they therefore prioritize governing economic and political activities over knowledge of the relationship between crises and sustainability. So how can we tackle the sovereign state system to address ecological system transgressions? The English School, through the work of Robert Faulkner and Barry Buzan, have identified that environmental stewardship constitutes a primary institution. And this is in addition to great power management, international law, the balance of power, diplomacy, and war. And that environmental stewardship informs how states behave internationally. This is reflected in the creation of the advancements of environmental norms, of rules, of institutions, and this includes international environmental agreements. International environmental agreements help uphold the international order because they require states in international society to do and to refrain from doing certain things. So it's considered a primary institution because it underpins the sovereign state system and provides means for coexistence and cooperation between states. And while there's certainly a great deal of variation in state compliance with international law, most states, as Hedley Bull famously said, follow most international law most of the time. But here is where the tension exists between creating and strengthening international environmental agreements and their secondary institutions like UNEP, Global Environment Fund, other environmental agencies, funding bodies, and the activities of the great powers. Research shows that the United States was a leader in creating international environmental agreements until the 1990s, and it has the most influence over international environmental agreements generally, although the European Union plays a significant role, and both China and India are catching up. But great power leadership and resources are vital to advancing international environmental agreements. And great power non-leadership, the absence or opposition by great powers, can undermine them. For Faulkner and Buzan, great powers exercise, therefore, both positive and negative powers, possessing the capacity to advance or delay action on environmental issues, as well as to produce or prevent environmental degradation. In global environmental politics, neither the systemic role of great powers nor the threat of the polycrisis seeks to challenge this idea of the international order, and it has not led to the provision of special rights for great powers. So the role of the great powers in addressing global environmental problems doesn't come from their position in the international order, but stems from their interests and their capacity for doing so, and their culpability in creating these crises. As a result, great powers have been both leaders and laggards in establishing protections for the environment. And as Stephen Bernstein notes, this means that the role of the great powers in environmental problems is less derived from their status than from their moral and normative argument that great powers should tackle environmental problems. So given the potential for great powers to advance further protections for the Earth, or their inability to do so, we should look further afield. Most recently, I've delved into the role that middle powers can play in global environmental politics. This is important from a constructivist viewpoint because middle powers are quite often the bellwether of appropriate behaviour for states in international relations. Great powers can be leaders or laggards, but if and when they lead, they need followers. These are often the middle powers, which possess the ideational and material capability to, for example, demonstrate adherence to a rules-based international order, as well as to implement international environmental agreements domestically. Sometimes middle powers can collectively work to shape components of the international system, even without the great powers, although this may become more difficult now. So middle powers are important to global environmental politics because seemingly positive or good international citizens like Australia, South Korea, and Canada can also have outsized environmental impacts in terms of resource use and emissions, with mixed records in meeting their international environmental agreement commitments. In probing the potential for middle powers I looked to my own country, Australia, as a quintessential middle power that possesses a reputation and sees itself identity-wise as a middle power, and see whether or not this yields a responsibility and capacity to act on global environmental issues. So this is pretty interesting. Australia has signed 100 international environmental agreements, amendments and protocols, and ratified more than that, 128. That Australia has ratified so many international environmental agreements demonstrates at least a preference for international environmental law and for multilateralism more broadly. So this fits very nicely into its own vision of itself as a good international citizen. But what we find is interesting in the fact that Australia's employment is more in terms of its negative environmental powers when looking at specific environmental crises. And here I looked with my colleague, Edda Gnaden, at two of the environmental crises: climate change and biodiversity loss and species extinction. And here we can identify that Australia employs its negative powers to not have ambitious nationally determined contributions. Indeed, just last week it announced that it was extending the life of 3 coal-fired power plants. And it has an appalling record in terms of attempting to reduce or reverse biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation. In fact, while standing up for its international reputation as upholding international rules-based order, it was at the same time quite willing to contribute to environmental devastation. Such was the stark disparity that I actually described this as being tantamount to ecocide. And this is a planned effort to eliminate part or all of an ecosystem. Now, I invoked the concept of ecocide in response to Australia's activities on the basis that this was to underscore the seriousness of the harm. And the seriousness of the harm is because it contributes to planet-wide, transformative and catastrophic harm triggered by a failure to act on climate and on biodiversity. And while there is no explicit statement by the Australian government, or any government, as far as I'm aware, at any level that they plan to eliminate a functioning climatic system or specific ecosystems and species, the federal government's actions do constitute willful contributions to their destruction. So given great and middle powers' unwillingness to address socio-ecological harms, where do we look? We look to the small powers, like Pacific Island countries, that are the most threatened by rising sea levels. We look to environmentalists who are increasingly at the mercy of draconian anti-protest and anti-foreign influence laws, even in robust democracies. We look to environmental defenders who risk their lives for their people and their place. We look to shame states to set goals, to meet minimum commitments, and to finance our survival. But this, of course, is only half of the story. Beyond the formal multilateralism of sovereign states and international environmental agreements, the vast majority of governance initiatives are now being undertaken transnationally. Peering at the role of non-state actors is to recognise the immense power of corporations that have been able to establish significant wealth and influence in the world and authority owing to their market position, with a very strong encouragement or perhaps absence of hindering from sovereign states. So many people in our community have written on the power of the corporations and conventional energy, renewable resources and commodities, and attempts to govern their supply chains. In 2021, LeBaron and Lister published their review of 290 studies of the effectiveness of the governance of global supply chains. And what they found was that most of these governance initiatives do not meet the criteria, their own criteria, for improving environmental and social problems, even against their own metrics. So this reinforces the design, reinforces concerns that global supply chains governance lacks accountability, given that they are designed by corporate actors whose primary interest is not to mitigate environmental and social harms. My own research with colleagues into critical minerals and renewables extractivism governance highlights, of course, the importance of international organizations such as the European Union and the OECD in establishing extraterritorial hard regulations in reference to the EU, as well as soft standards for companies to accede to in relation to the OECD. A significant number of these initiatives seek to undertake this idea of proxy accountability, where those from the global north, particularly by or at the behest of NGOs and civil society, seek to hold companies and supply chains emanating from the global south to account. Now, more recent research examines how the global south seeks to engage in transnational governance in terms of how those in the global south can participate, can engage with, and indeed can create their own initiatives for governing. So the global south remains significant for many reasons. It is a place of multiple sites for extraction, natural resources, for raw commodities, and increasingly for renewable energy. It is also the home to many amazing peoples, cultures, and biodiversity. Research into the creation of international grievance mechanisms for the multilateral development banks, where I've spent way too much of my life, was to focus on why these were created to address environmental and social harm from development projects. And they revealed that the same types of problems resurface again and again and again. Even in the instances where multilateral development banks, like the World Bank, were seeking to provide funding for development projects for the benefit of people, approximately 1% of development projects end up leading to a claim for recourse with their grievance mechanism. In the case of the World Bank, this is its World Bank Inspection Panel. So the banks have now, and when I talk about the multilateral development banks, there's an African bank, Asian Bank, Inter-American Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. These are all banks to provide financing for sovereign loans primarily, although increasingly for non-sovereign loans as well, to developing countries or companies in developing countries for development projects. And most of these banks have now established environmental and social frameworks backed by these international accountability mechanisms or grievance processes. And they seek to provide people in project-affected areas access to recourse should they or their environment be impacted by a development project. International grievance mechanisms are non-legal. These are non-binding. These are increasingly used to provide recourse for people suffering environmental and social harm from internationally developed development projects. So these are defined as international mechanisms created by transnational or international actors that give affected or potentially affected people the right to recourse for their impacts of their activities, especially when they have no access to a liability mechanism, so some form of legal recourse. Now, one of the reasons I mention this is because this idea of international grievance mechanisms has flourished to the point of being recognised as an international norm. So it's used by corporations, it's used across different sectors, from rugs to companies that produce laptops to sneakers, but it's also very, very, very at home in international development finance specifically. So it's really important to know what it is that people are seeking recourse for as a very first step to understanding whether or not grievance mechanisms can address people's needs and whether or not this needs to help re-influence or shape global governance institutions. So the types of recurrent problems that can contribute to significant harm from human rights abuses or sustained environmental degradation really center on 4 common grievances. Overwhelmingly, 49% of the cases in my database, which stretches back over 30 years, is that people lack information. They don't know what's happening in their communities. Now, that percentage is much higher in other studies undertaken by NGOs, but there are qualitative differences among the databases. The second dominant concern that make people seek recourse is fundamentally a lack of participation in the decisions that affect them. And in my database, that's approximately a quarter of claims, really being unhappy that they had no way of engaging with what was happening around them and sometimes directly to them. The other 2 are quite significant. Involuntary resettlement, where people are pushed off their lands without due compensation, and transgressions of Indigenous peoples' policy. And quite often this relates directly to what is now known as free, prior, and informed consent. And so this is where we can identify how people in the global north can help. Proxy accountability is one way, acting on behalf of people, but enabling accountability is being able to provide support and solidarity to people in the global south. This is to provide the direct means of enabling environmental defenders, wherever they are, to hold global institutions to account for the direct impacts that they have on their communities. This gets, I think, to the heart of the polycrisis, and this gets us a step closer to being able to use these examples, provide these cases of ways in which we can enable accountability in global governance institutions. Of course, there are gaps and traps in global institutions. And I just want to highlight this as a way of talking through some of the new research that I've been doing with colleagues around critical minerals governance. And the governance gaps is really, if we focus on the fact that we have the European Union undertaking extraterritorial legislation in some cases to identify what comes into their market, the soft standards or guidelines being undertaken by the OECD, and then a whole plethora of governance institutions. And this is not specific to critical minerals governance. We see it across renewable energy, we see it across climate, we see it in a range of different places, but we can highlight specifically that even when there's a whole lot of governing going on, there still may be significant gaps. And the gaps in critical minerals governance that we identified is that there's a very small number of initiatives that look at all critical minerals that are used in the transition to renewable energy, for solar, for wind, for lithium-ion batteries. And there's a whole lot of minerals that just aren't governed. And this really focuses our attention. A recent paper published by colleagues notes that 60% of the literature on critical minerals looks at cobalt in the DRC and lithium in the lithium-ion triangle in Latin America. This leaves a whole host of minerals not governed. The other thing that where the gaps occur, it's not just what is being governed, but it's also what is not being governed. And we can identify that when we have these voluntary types of transnational initiatives, that there are certain things that may be left out. In particular, reference to Indigenous peoples and so on. So this is where gaps can occur in the broader system. The focus of establishing the types of governance initiatives to address the polycrisis within a containerized sovereign state system is that it still may lead to accountability traps. This is specifically where even if the initiative is multi-stakeholder, the purposes or the normative logics of those that are creating the institution may still fall into identifying ways in which you can meet the goals of the institution that don't necessarily actually address the crisis. And that is a fundamental challenge for all stakeholders involved. Now, I want to just finish on, whoops, go backwards, on this final question, which is how we move from undertaking a transition to fundamentally transforming global governance. And some of the things that I've talked about is really that we can change the international system, we can change global governance, because fundamentally we are talking about a larger cultural complex of modernity. And this is where the sovereign state is bound, but that it may be subject to pressures for change, this idea of constitution and co-constitution, that this can come from grassroots constituents, this can come from science, this can come from cross-border transnational activity, and it can come from different generations working together. And what this highlights is the potential for states to reframe their understanding of crises as normal sociological events that the sovereign state is responsible for. And here I want to talk not about specific institutions, but the way in which we can transition from a new disorder to something truly transformative following 3 Ps and 4 Rs. The first P is principles. And this is really to have joined up thinking across states, corporations, non-state actors, multi-stakeholder, single stakeholder institutions. And we are already starting to see evidence of this shift where laws and standards are coming into alignment. The UN guiding principles on human rights are now starting to blend with and overlap, if not have some similarities with the multilateral development bank's environmental and social standards. So one of the clearest examples of that is free, prone, and informed consent, where up until relatively recently, the World Bank would only go as far as informed consultation. So this is, FPIC is commonly used, it's commonly understood, if it's not always applied in practice. So we can identify principles that we can press all actors to commit to. And this takes us to the first R, rights. Rights for people for a healthy environment and rights of nature to exist, repair, and regenerate. I can see that happening already around the world through the UN, through particular advocacy, through legislation, through legal challenges, consistently advocating for them in multiple fora through all available means. This is a movement. The second P is process. Now, many of people in our community have worked on deliberative democracy, non-Western forms of negotiations such as Talanoa to address matters to society. Fundamental processes of engagement and governing are really about listening and learning. Without listening and learning, we will continue into the worst trajectory of the human project. From listening and learning, we also hope to rectify past harms through providing the second and the third Rs, recourse, which I've spent a little bit of time on, and remedy. We need not just to hear about how harm occurs, but to also seek to provide a remedy for those least able to manage. This, again, is increasingly being advocated through the European Union institutions and has certainly been on the table or put on the table for the multilateral development banks. The third P is penalties. I've talked about the absence of one big R, responsibility, but to ensure that we move from empty rhetoric, we need the fourth R, regulation. This is really to hold states and corporations accountable for their actions. Only then will we be able to transform to a more sustainable way of life. Whether or not this happens fast enough, of course, is yet to be seen. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Susan. I'll give you applause. I'm sure everyone else is clapping as well. Unfortunately, I think we can't, if you're an attendee, even if you're a speaker, you can't hit the little clap sign. So thank you very much, Susan. Now I believe we have some time open for questions. I believe if you click on the Q&A, Susan will be moderating this herself. And you should be able to raise your hand, ask questions. Although if I'm honest, I'm not entirely certain how that works in the ESG system that we have here. So we may have to do some trial and error. But if there are any questions.
Webinars are always quite different, aren't they?
They are, yeah. So I really appreciate your talk, Susan, and the 4 P's and 3 R's. Did I get that right?
Yeah, 3 P's, 4 R's.
3 P's, 4 R's. I always mix things up like that. But how do we get, so you see us moving in that direction, but there's this sort of, with polycrisis, there's this balance between threat, right, and opportunity. How do you see that balance working out in the future? And what kinds of things can people do, particularly scholars, to try to push us more towards those opportunities and away from those threats?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I mean, I think one of the issues that we all grapple with is the urgency. And that is often used as a reason to skip the deliberative bit where you actually consult widely, you talk about what might work. I mean, I think there's enough studies that have been done to show that more diverse groups make better decisions. But we don't actually see that very often in a number of different fora. And that goes for global governance institutions, it goes for corporations, it goes for governments. Where there is that failure to deliberate on the basis that there's no time. And I think that tension of trying to be able to be truly deliberative and come up with the best option or the least worst option quite often gets sidelined. Decisions aren't always made in ways that that have challenges to them because of power imbalances. And so to think about ways where once you get started, you can actually continue to take advantage of the opportunities of having the people in the room, the diversity of opinion and knowledge to be able to really transform systems. Because what I see quite often in some of these spaces is the fact that we look to the environmental defenders, we look to the environmentalists, we look to the most vulnerable because they're going to fight, they have to fight, they have no choice, as being the answer. But the people in the room are the ones with the power and the resources to be able, so to blend those where you actually have a fundamental agreement between those with influence and power and those with the passion and the knowledge of the irreparable harm that will happen without it would be incredibly transformative. So this is a great question.
Yeah, I see one question.
So what is the strength of developing countries in international environmental agreements? It looks as if they're lagging behind. That's a fantastic question. Other people may also have something to weigh in here. I think it does depend. Some of the broader studies that have looked at the role of negotiations have identified that early on in negotiations, developed and developing countries have a much more level playing field. Once you get to the harder points where it looks like it's going to be solidified into negotiation, like harder into text, that's when the power balance can change. And you get some harder negotiating coming from those that are more powerful. Again, people, fabulous scholars in this room might have other opinions, but there we sort of can't talk about developing countries as a monolith, right? I mean, China continues to call itself a developing country, which is being challenged by the United States. And I think you can definitely point to China and India as being somewhat separate from what used to be the group of 77. So in terms of strength in negotiations, there's definitely a strong power imbalance, but trying to find sort of ways and means through which they can sort of have, I guess in terms of Pacific Island countries, it's really that normative power that they continue to hold the line, and that they use their shaming tactics and their moral suasion to hold to a certain standard. So perhaps I'm sort of balancing here between traditionally understood they don't have that much power, but they can still be quite powerful in terms of the sort of bottom line. We've got a great question from Stefan. Good to see your question. How do you define the pool of middle powers and who to harness them to push for transformation? This is really great. So there's great disagreement as to who or what is a middle power. There's 3 different schools of thought. One is based purely on material capability, guns and so on. The second one is more ideational. Do they call themselves a middle power? Do they think of themselves as that? And then there's a third category that sort of has a sort of bit of both. So some of them are self-identified. Australia calls itself a middle power. There are a sort of band of about 22 states that my colleagues at the University of Sydney have identified as what most people recognise as middle powers. And then they wrote a really fun book called Awkward Powers, which is the countries that actually would technically fit a lot of those categories, but for some reason or other, people don't like them. Like maybe they transgress certain norms and therefore aren't seen as a typical middle power. So these are countries like Iran that fit but don't fit. So this is how would you harness them to push towards transformation? So again, it's got to come from multiple different actors at different scales. When Australia finally agreed to move towards net zero, that was classic pressure from outside. That came from the build-up to the COP, where it was the UK, it was the High Ambition Coalition, it was states pressuring Australia to actually recognise that it had to get on board. That was incredibly powerful. That didn't come from Australians, despite Australians overwhelmingly supporting a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from Australia. That came from outside. So I think different countries might have different pressure points to move towards the 3 Ps and the 4 Rs. But again, it's got to come from multiple places, I think, to really help tip that balance. And that's the constitutive nature of moving into a sort of different way of thinking and a different way of being.
All right. I don't see any more questions coming up. And I do think we are actually, oh, there's Frank.
I think somehow my settings are that I can't type a question, so I have to ask it. Fantastic presentation. So I have a question related a bit to the World Bank. And don't we need, I mean, the one point is to reform the World Bank and work on different accountability systems in the bank, but don't we need maybe totally different financial institutions? I mean, like we worked with many of us, led by Johan Roxum and Louis Coetzee, on this article on planetary commons, identifying planetary commons. And then the question is, don't we need totally different financial institutions to deal with particular novel types of challenges? For example, protecting the rainforest, in a sense. Is the World Bank, are these the right mechanisms, or don't we have to think about modern ways, I mean, more fitting to our current century, more fitting to the geopolitical relations that we have, that are going beyond the World Bank? I don't know what actually it could be, but just an open question for one of the world's leading experts on the World Bank. I mean, do we need something else? I mean, what is the World Bank or the Bank 2.0, the financial arbiter 2.0 in the 21st century, that goes beyond what we have to protect the planetary commons and the main interest that we have and the concerns? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think you're right. For a long time there, I actually did think we needed to break up the bank, that we shouldn't be using this institution in this way anymore. And you talk to people in different countries that still have it's really divisive, right? Some people are very anti-World Bank. There are very long histories in some regions and some parts of some countries where the bank is known for having such a negative impact. It's very, very hard for people in Pacific Island countries, for example, to demand and want and request a loss and damage fund, and then to have it located in the bank. This for them is just not behind the sort of what they envisaged as something that could help them in the way that they need help. So, previously scholars have talked about, there's helpful help and there's unhelpful help, and the World Bank quite often can provide unhelpful help. So trying to think about ways in which you can deal with novel challenges, it's not dealt with public goods very well. It's partnership process of trying to restructure in order to address climate and biodiversity. These haven't been particularly successful. They've tended to reinforce the types of processes that the bank does well. And that's, too direct, to be hierarchical, to make it based on financial considerations. I do think that there is room for different ways of providing financial support. You perhaps have a better grasp on some of the REDD+, about whether or not this provides better opportunities for people in developing countries that work and live in forests to have more of a say. I would like to see smaller things rolled out in different ways. It's one of those typical sort of advocacies of more innovation, more experimentation, more trying to see what works. I think one of the issues is, yes, we do need resources to address these crises, but the financialization often works in favor of the bankers and the investors and the venture capitalists, not necessarily in terms of actually addressing the problem. And this is one of the accountability traps that I see is fundamental, and it's rife throughout the sort of financial institutions necessary to address these types of crises. Not that long ago, I probably might have recommended it go through sovereign states in some ways, like national development banks. But having spent more time looking at my own country, I'm not entirely convinced that might be a good idea, even for democratically stable, relatively corrupt-free countries. So that's quite a challenge. Whether or not that there are some principles that could be established to enable that experimentation by a range of different actors might get us closer, but again, there has to be transparency, there has to be accountability. This raises the costs. This means there are fewer actors that are able to undertake these types of activities. So collectives, cooperatives, fantastic stuff that came out of Germany with their Energiewende, you know, the types of transitions that can be led by communities. I'd like to see more of that or hear more about that. I guess I'm focusing more on the local. What really happens at the local can be global in its impact. So that's kind of some possibilities.
Thanks, Susan. I see there is a question from Donastri in the question and answer, but we are running short on time. And I know there are a few announcements Cristina has to make towards the end. So maybe Cristina, you can make the announcements and Susan can think about her answer. Then we'll switch.
Sounds good.
Okay, yes. No, firstly, I would like to thank you, DG, for putting together this session, Susan, for your brilliant, yeah, it was brilliant, really. And now I'm thinking so much about the 3 Ps, 4 Rs, and how we, yeah, well, how we rethink governance in this polycrisis, how you conceptualize polycrisis. Well, I wanted to also make a question, but I think we have to wrap up. So I would like to thank again Professor Susan Park, Dr. DG Webster, to congratulate again Frank Beeman for your prize. We are so proud of you. Thank you so much for all your more than 25 years of work on the network to create the concept of a system, to bring us as a community, in a very diverse community, I want to say. I would like also to announce the next sessions. Should I share the screen again just for people to see? Just like sorry. Yes, sorry for this. Let's see. Can you see something there? No. Can you see the screen or no? Do you see my screen? No? Okay, so I'll leave it without. So we starting at 2:30. We have 3 sessions. One is the evolution of a system law, innovating new legal principles for the Anthropocene. Is that it's reorganized by the Task Force on Earth System Law. And the next, also another session on towards the fossil fuel-free future, governance challenges and opportunities for leaving fossil fuel underground, is the Research Center Amsterdam. Finally, we also have a roundtable on the Summit of the Futures, the Task Force on Sustainable Development Goals, all of them starting at 2:30 Central European Time. And I would like to highlight that we will have a joint session of task force, research centers, and working groups. One will be on Tuesday, October 15th, at 1 p.m. Toronto time, 6 London time, 10:30 New Delhi, and 4 a.m. Canberra. Sorry, it's very early for Canberra. But on Wednesday, there will be another joint task force working group research center session at October 16, 4 a.m. Toronto, 9 a.m. London, 1:30 p.m. New Delhi, 7 p.m. Canberra. And these joint sessions are very important because it's an opportunity to build dialogue between task forces, working groups, and research centers. So all are invited. So with that, I would like to thank again our panelists, congratulate again Frank, and hope to see you all during the whole week. Thank you so much. Are we done? Yes. I don't know if everybody's there. Bye-bye.